In September 2010, two fishermen, Evan Kade and Mark Helson, vanished without a trace after leaving Meeks Bay Marina on Lake Tahoe. For 6 years, they were presumed dead, victims of a deep lake accident or some mysterious incident that no one witnessed. But in August 2016, the boat Silver Finch suddenly reappeared, drifting quietly to shore near Rubicon Point. Inside the boat was Evan Kade, alive but unrecognizable. What he told police when he was finally able to speak shocked even the most seasoned investigators. Where had he been for those 6 years, and what had really happened to Mark Helson? Before diving into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. At dawn, on September 14, 2010, the Meeks Bay Marina area on Lake Tahoe was still shrouded in the characteristic thin mist of early fall. The temperature was low, the water surface was calm and flat, with no strong wind, creating favorable conditions for early fishing trips. At 5 a.m., Evan Kade, 31 years old, a resident of Reno, and Mark Helson, 33 years old, living in South Lake Tahoe, arrived at the dock to prepare for their annual fishing trip. Both were very familiar with the lake area and had many years of experience on the water. They loaded their gear onto the silver boat named Silver Finch, checked the fuel tank, tackle boxes, inspected the engine and navigation lights according to their usual routine before every trip. Security cameras at the marina recorded the entire preparation process, including the moment they left the dock at 5:18 a.m. heading straight toward the open water between Meeks Bay and Emerald Bay. This was the last recorded data of the two men's presence on the lake. For years, Evan and Mark always stayed in touch with their families whenever they went fishing, at least with a short text message or a call reporting their location when the sun rose. But that morning, both of their phones had no signal. By noon, the families began to notice something unusual when they received no updates whatsoever. By early afternoon, they tried calling multiple times, but all calls showed out of coverage area. Some relatives went directly to the marina to check, but found no sign of the boat returning or any indication that the men had come back. The prolonged period of silence caused the families to shift from worry to suspecting that an accident had occurred. When the clock struck 5 p.m., nearly 12 hours had passed since Evan and Mark left the dock, and the families still had received no signal, no call, no message, and no sign of the boat returning to the marina. Faced with the clear possibility of a serious incident on the lake, the families decided to stop waiting and officially contacted the El Dorado County Sheriff's Office to report them missing. Immediately after receiving the report, the Sheriff's Office activated the standard emergency search protocol, dispatching search and rescue teams to Meeks Bay Marina. Less than 40 minutes later, the first rescue boat left the dock in the late afternoon light, carrying the rapid response team and high-powered spotlights, beginning to sweep along the shoreline areas as darkness gradually fell. At the same time, a support helicopter from South Lake Tahoe was deployed, flying along the western shore of the lake to scan the entire water surface in the probable direction of travel of the Silver Finch. The SR teams focused on two main objectives, looking for floating signs on the surface and checking natural entry-exit points where currents might carry objects to shore, including rocky strips along the water's edge, small secluded coves, and forested areas directly adjacent to the lake. People present at the marina early that morning were interviewed that very night, mostly maintenance staff, boat renters, and a few tourists who were at the dock around 6 a.m. No one recalled seeing the boat return or hearing any unusual sounds on the water. One man said he had seen the taillights of a small boat at a distance heading south, but he could not confirm whether it was the Silver Finch. Police collected data from the marina's active radar, recording the movement of vessels on the lake that morning of September 14th. The record showed the Silver Finch departing the harbor area at 5:18 a.m., but from 5:30 to 6:20 a.m., there was an unusual gap in the radar. No reflected signals from the boat, positioning devices, or any other vessel in the area where the Silver Finch was expected to be traveling. This gap was not sufficient to draw a conclusion, but was considered a noteworthy detail because it coincided with the period when the boat could have been quite far from shore, out of camera range, but still within radar coverage. Throughout the night of the 14th and into the early morning of the 15th, search teams continued sweeping the water surface, using wide-beam spotlights to look for reflections from metal or floating objects. No signs of the boat, life jackets, tackle boxes, or any gear were found. The helicopter team flew low along the western and northern shores, but detected no signals from electronic devices such as phones, GPS, or automatic rescue beacons. Police checked docking points and small piers along West Lake Boulevard to confirm whether the boat might have returned to a different location, but no one reported an unfamiliar boat docking that morning. By the end of the first day, the SR team expanded the search area in a fan pattern, based on the average speed of the Silver Finch and the light wind conditions that morning. On the second day, the search continued with increased intensity. SEACHR established 3 parallel search lines extending from shore toward the middle of the lake, each separated by a few hundred meters. Rescue boat teams were assigned to sweep their respective areas, while ground teams checked every possible trail leading from the lake into the forest, in case the boat had an accident and the men had to swim ashore and walk to find help. However, no footprints or drag marks were found on the sand or damp soil. By the third day, helicopter information continued to show the lake surface completely devoid of any sign of the Silver Finch. From the data collected in the first 72 hours, the rescue forces established the initial search radius, a wide arc extending from Meeks Bay to Emerald Bay, extending 2 nautical miles to the north and 3 nautical miles to the south. This radius was based on the distance the boat could have traveled during the radar blackout period, combined with the fact that the lake was quite calm that morning. Despite maximum efforts, SEACHR had still found no direct evidence that the boat had capsized, sunk, or collided, nor any indication that Evan and Mark had returned to shore after leaving the marina. At the end of the initial 72-hour search period, all data was compiled and reported back to the sheriff's office, marking the completion of the first phase of the SEACHR operation without any significant leads. After completing the initial emergency search phase, SEACHR forces shifted to advanced search methods, focusing on underwater surveys, using sonar and deploying divers in areas with feasible depths. At this point, the goal was to determine whether the Silver Finch might have sunk in shallow water near shore or become lodged on a natural underwater obstruction. First, the high-frequency sonar team was deployed from Meeks Bay, moving in an expanding fan pattern toward Emerald Bay and Rubicon Point, concentrating on areas shallower than 150 feet, the limit at which sonar could produce clear images of large objects. The sonar returns on the first day showed a relatively clean lake bottom, with only clusters of submerged rocks and long dead tree trunks from years past, and absolutely no shapes resembling the nearly 16-foot-long hull of the Silver Finch. To be certain, the team adjusted the equipment to high-resolution mode and rescanned the area twice within a 2 nautical mile radius from the marina. The results remained unchanged. No large object lay beneath the sediment or was trapped in depressions on the lake bottom. On the second day of the sonar phase, SEACHR forces moved to the southern waters, where depth increased rapidly but remained within the equipment's limits. Parallel scan lines were carried out systematically from shore toward the middle of the lake, each spaced several dozen meters apart to ensure nothing was missed. Although the area was considered to have many submerged rocks and a high chance of snagging, sonar still recorded no structure matching the size or shape of a small sunken boat. A few anomalous reflections were marked and rechecked, but all turned out to be large submerged tree trunks or rocks that had slid from the northern slopes. There were no signs of scratches, gouges, or any structural damage, indicating a severe underwater collision. While sonar continued, the dive team was deployed to the 2 most likely areas, the steep rocky shore of Rubicon Point and the waters near the entrance to Emerald Bay. However, diving operations faced clear limitations. The Rubicon Point area had a sudden depth change, from 40-50 feet near shore dropping straight down to over 1,200 feet, just a few dozen meters out. Divers could only search the shallow zone under 120 feet, but they found no debris from the boat, no torn netting, broken wood, or items that might have floated and then sunk, such as tackle boxes or fuel cans. At Emerald Bay, the water was calm and visibility better, but the lake bottom in this area had been surveyed multiple times in previous search operations, and this time yielded no results either. The dive team returned to shore after nearly 3 hours of inspection, without finding any evidence to support the possibility of a collision or snagging on submerged rocks. When underwater searches produced no new signals, SAR shifted to analyzing meteorological data and lake currents on September 14th to build drift models for the Silver Finch. Based on records from the Tahoe City Weather Station, surface winds between 5 o'clock, 7 a.m. were light, shifting from west to northeast, with average speeds of 3-5 knots. This allowed simulation of the boat's natural trajectory if the engine had failed and the boat drifted without external force. Drift models were created under 3 scenarios: free drift, wind-influenced near-shore drift, and drift combined with circular water movement near the bays. All 3 models shared one common point: if the boat was near the radar blackout location between 5:30–6:20 a.m., it would still have drifted to one of 3 shoreline areas within 2–4 hours, and there, even if it did not run aground, it should at least have left physical traces, such as wood fragments, scratches on rocks, or floating items. However, SAR found no such traces in any of the 3 predicted shoreline areas. This led to consideration of the possibility that the Silver Finch suddenly sank in deep water, but sonar and divers found no supporting evidence for this hypothesis. After more than 40 hours of sonar scanning, 12 hours of helicopter reconnaissance, and 8 dive inspections at high-probability sites, the search forces were forced to conclude that within the surveyed area, no object matching the size of the Silver Finch existed. The boat did not appear in shallow waters, was not lodged at the edge of submerged rocks, showed no signs of sinking or collision, and was not detected in any drift model. After nearly a week of implementing all in-depth search methods, from sonar sweeps, diver deployment, to detailed lake current analysis, SAR was forced to admit that the enhanced operation had produced no new investigative leads. All data was compiled and transferred back to the El Dorado County Sheriff's Office, marking the point at which underwater search options officially reached their practical limit. However, the absence of the boat or sinking evidence did not mean the search was completely terminated. While underwater operations were scaled back, surface search teams continued to expand their sweep range, shifting focus to collecting and examining every floating object, in the hope that even the smallest detail might reveal something about the fate of Evan or Mark. Over the next 3 days following the lake bottom scanning phase, SAR teams on rescue boats conducted surface sweeps using a grid pattern, concentrating on areas near the western shore and points where natural currents intersected with wind patterns. Near Sugar Pine Point, the search team discovered a dark green baseball cap floating about 60 meters from shore. The object was immediately recovered, brought aboard, and transferred to the temporary analysis station at the marina. The cap's surface was slightly weathered, and no clear branding remained. Forensic examination of microfibers, DNA traces, and residue inside found no characteristics matching the profiles of Evan or Mark. The cap was determined to most likely belong to another visitor from weeks earlier. Leaving that area, SAR discovered another piece of driftwood floating freely near the entrance to Emerald Bay. The wood showed heavy weathering, rounded edges from long-term erosion, and no signs of sudden fracture. Its size and wood type did not match the composite and aluminum materials of the Silver Finch. Paint color checks, fiber structure, and moisture analysis showed the object had been in the lake for at least several years and was unrelated to the events of September 14th. The next day, another object was found in the northern area of Rubicon Point, a rusted fishing hook caught in a piece of lake weed. After recovery, the forensic unit determined that this type of hook belonged to a low-cost product line, not the type Evan or Mark used according to family information. The degree of rust indicated it had been submerged for a long time before resurfacing. No fingerprints, DNA, or any evidence linked it to the 2 missing men. SAR teams continued searching for smaller items, such as plastic fragments, foam pieces, fishing line, or tackle box lids, but everything collected lacked investigative value. Notably, no life jackets were found floating on the surface. On a small boat like the Silver Finch, life jackets were typically stored in the forward compartment, and in the event of a violent capsize, at least some would likely have been dislodged. However, not a single life jacket appeared during days of searching, raising questions among investigators about whether the boat had actually capsized in nearshore areas. Additionally, there were no signs of tackle boxes, toolboxes, water bottles, or personal items, things that would almost certainly float if the boat had an accident. Checks of data from other docks and vessels operating at the same time also found no reports of strange objects being recovered on the day of the incident. All surface-collected evidence was compiled and analyzed in the mobile forensic unit at the marina. The final conclusion was unanimous. No evidence connected to Evan Kade or Mark Helson was found. Everything recovered consisted only of old debris or previously floating items, with no DNA, no fingerprints, and no signs of recent contact. As the surface search concluded, without yielding any further clues, SAR forces were forced to move to the overall assessment phase. After nearly 2 weeks of deploying every feasible method, from sonar sweeps, mobilizing divers, surface scanning of the lake, to analyzing every smallest object, the SAR team and the El Dorado County Sheriff's Office conducted a comprehensive synthesis of all data. The consolidated report reached an unavoidable conclusion. There is no evidence confirming the presence of the Silver Finch boat or the 2 missing fishermen anywhere within the entire searched area, despite rescue forces having covered nearly the entire western portion of the lake surface. Key findings include: marina radar recorded the boat leaving the dock, but losing signal afterward. Sonar detected no submerged object of comparable size to the boat. Divers found no signs of collision or debris. No life jackets, positioning devices, toolboxes, or any personal items were found floating on the surface, and all retrieved objects were forensically ruled out as related to the disappearance. These factors lead to the assessment that the most plausible hypothesis consistent with the data is a sudden accident in deep water. Lake Tahoe's unusual depth, with many areas dropping straight down to 1,200 to 1,600 feet, just dozens of meters from shore, makes recovery of bodies or a sunken boat virtually impossible using standard search equipment. The cold water temperature and extreme pressure also allow a boat or small object to sink straight to the bottom without leaving any surface traces. In the final technical meeting in early November 2010, SAR commanders presented that all reasonable search options had been exhausted, and there was no basis to expand the search area further without specific new leads. Based on the consolidated results, the sheriff issued the official conclusion: the incident is classified as a boat capsizing accident resulting in death, with the boat and bodies most likely located in deep water beyond the reach of available search equipment. Although there is no direct evidence of capsizing, this conclusion is based on the absence of any factors indicating violence, crime, or any other scenario besides an unexpected incident on the lake. The families of the 2 victims reacted strongly, arguing that the conclusion was reached too soon, but investigators contended that there was no objective data to keep the case open. By the end of 2010, the missing persons files for Evan Kade and Mark Helson were officially closed and transferred to the cold case unit, where they would only be reviewed if new leads emerged in the future. The Lake Tahoe disappearance is recorded as a non-recovery accident case, a situation that has occurred multiple times in the lake's history due to its unique terrain and extreme depth. The entire search operation was terminated, personnel were withdrawn from the area, reports were archived, and the case entered a prolonged period of silence with no new investigative directions at that time. From 2011 to 2015, the missing persons files of Evan Kade and Mark Helson remained in the cold case category with no new developments. After the official search campaign ended and the accident conclusion was issued at the end of 2010, no information from residents around Lake Tahoe indicated the appearance of evidence the boat, or any unusual signs related to the two missing men. Boat owners, fishing guides, lakeside resort staff, and summer tourists were periodically questioned by patrol officers, but no one reported seeing suspicious floating objects or hearing unusual sounds in the following months. The marina radar system was checked for any unusual return signals, but showed no changes compared to the original data. In 2011, Evan and Mark's families submitted a request to review the case, citing the lack of specific evidence proving an accident had actually occurred. The cold case unit accepted the request but, after file review, concluded there was no basis to reopen the case because all original data still pointed to the accident hypothesis and no additional information had emerged to redirect the investigation. In 2012, the file underwent its first periodic review per county procedure. A small team of 3 investigators re-examined the SR reports, sonar images, drift maps, and all miscellaneous evidence analyzed in the first year. No new findings or overlooked anomalies were discovered. The absence of the boat on sonar and the lack of floating evidence were noted as not unusual for a deep-water lake like Tahoe, where non-recovery boat sinkings had been documented in the past. The review concluded with the determination to maintain the original finding: the incident was most likely an accident. Over the next 2 years, no significant developments occurred. Residents around Lake Tahoe continued normal activities, and the tourist season proceeded as usual. Periodic patrols by lake management recorded some small floating debris or tourist trash, but nothing of size or characteristics related to the Silver Finch. The victims' families maintained contact with authorities, but all responses remained the same: no new information. By 2014, the cold case unit conducted a second review. At this point, some new sonar analysis technologies had been implemented in other search campaigns, leading certain investigators to hope they could be applied to old data. However, the review could only be performed on previously recorded sonar images, as the deep water areas of Tahoe had not been rescanned since 2010. The new analyses confirmed that no shapes in the old data could represent the capsized or sunken Silver Finch. The review also rechecked the meteorological report for September 14, 2010, cross-referencing wind and current models, but results remained unchanged. Weather conditions were consistent with a rapid accident scenario, causing the boat to sink directly into deep water without leaving surface traces. After this review, investigators officially notified the families that the file remained in cold case status and would only be reopened with new evidence. In the final 2 years of the 2011-2015 period, the situation remained completely stagnant. No positioning devices pinged, no cell phone signals, no reports from visitors, and no unusual objects appeared on the lake surface. The missing persons file continued to sit in the cold case category, with the only reasonable conclusion at the time still being accident, despite the lack of direct proof. For the Lake Tahoe community, the story of Evan and Mark gradually became a familiar reminder of the dangers of deep water, and almost no one still expected any change. Yet that silence was broken 6 years later. On the morning of August 22, 2016, a kayaker paddling along Rubicon Point suddenly spotted a silvery object drifting slowly more than 100 meters from shore. Approaching for a closer look, he realized it was a small silver boat, unmanned, and the shape was so familiar it stunned him. It was identical to the Silver Finch that had appeared on search flyers in 2010. The boat's windshield was covered with a thin layer of water dust and algae, the metal surface dulled, but the overall structure showed no signs of major breakage or severe damage. What caught the kayaker's attention most was that the boat remained perfectly level, neither listing nor sinking at the bow or stern, a condition inconsistent with an object presumed missing for 6 years. Getting closer, he saw a human figure lying inside the cockpit, slumped to one side, motionless. After shouting repeatedly with no response, the kayaker quickly used his phone to report to Tahoe Lake Patrol. Within less than 15 minutes, the first patrol boat reached the scene and positively identified the vessel as the Silver Finch based on the hull registration number and distinctive cockpit features. 4 patrol officers approached the boat, checked the condition of the person inside, and discovered the individual was still breathing faintly. Preliminary identification matched images of Evan Kade from the missing persons file, build, hair, and a small scar near the hairline. There were no signs of struggle in the boat, no blood, and no other equipment present besides the motionless body and some naturally attached algae patches. Evan was lifted out of the cockpit and transferred to the patrol boat for first aid, while another team secured the Silver Finch for towing to Rubicon Point shore. Recognizing the victim's severe deterioration, patrol called for an ambulance from Tahoe City. When paramedics reached the nearby landing area, medical personnel continued treatment for severe dehydration and mild hypothermia, while Evan remained unconscious, eyes closed, and unresponsive to any auditory stimuli, maintaining only weak and unstable breathing. Once vital signs were temporarily stabilized for safe transport, Evan was taken directly to Barton Memorial Hospital. Upon arrival, as he was moved into the emergency department, the medical team immediately coordinated with investigative representatives to initiate the identity confirmation protocol for long-term missing persons cases. Fingerprints were collected first and run through the El Dorado County system, quickly returning a match with Evan Kade's records from 2008 when he registered for a work permit in Nevada. Dental comparison was conducted in parallel to rule out any possibility of misidentification, especially given the victim's emaciated condition that rendered visual identification unreliable. Characteristic dental features and jaw structure fully matched the dental records previously provided by Evan's dentist in Reno, conclusively closing the identification process. The conclusion was beyond doubt. The man found on the Silver Finch was Evan Kade, missing since September 2010. Once identity was confirmed, focus immediately shifted from who to what happened. In the 48 hours following Evan's admission to Barton Memorial Hospital, the medical team conducted a series of in-depth examinations to comprehensively assess his physiological condition. Initial results quickly showed this could not be the aftermath of a short-term incident, but rather evidence of a prolonged, multi-year deterioration process, clearly demonstrated by DEXA scan bone density analysis, showing severe reduction in both long bones and the spine, a form of degeneration only seen after extended periods of severely restricted mobility. The orthopedics report explicitly stated that Evan's skeletal structure was consistent with someone who had spent at least 5 to 6 years in near-total inability to stand upright or engage in normal activity, matching cases of individuals confined in extremely confined spaces. Blood tests further revealed severe vitamin D deficiency, with levels far below the minimum acceptable threshold. This is a classic sign of prolonged lack of sunlight exposure, as the body cannot naturally synthesize vitamin D without it. This finding completely ruled out the possibility that Evan had only recently met with misfortune, as anyone living outdoors or drifting on the lake for even a few days would have had sufficient sun exposure to prevent such extreme deficiency. Examination of skin around the wrists and ankles revealed old circular scars located precisely where restraints are typically applied. The scars showed 2 layers of tissue, an inner layer formed approximately 4 or 5 years earlier, and an outer layer that was newer but still old scarring, indicating repeated restraint over multiple periods. These marks lacked characteristics of accidental injury or natural friction, and instead bore the specific pattern of long-term fixation using small-diameter rope or metal chain. Additionally, the dermatology team noted areas of hard calluses on the elbows and knees, formed from frequently pressing the body against a hard surface in confined space, such as prolonged sitting in a crouched position, kneeling or sleeping on wooden flooring. These signs further confirmed that Evan had lived for years under conditions of tightly controlled posture and space. Analysis of urine, skin tissue, and skin surface microbiological samples revealed the presence of several bacterial strains characteristic of stagnant water environments in enclosed spaces. These were not common bacteria found in the natural well-circulating waters of Lake Tahoe. Instead, the bacterial profile matched samples previously recorded in cases of confinement in sealed basements or old boathouses with high humidity and near-zero light. The official microbiology report described a combination of 3 bacterial types, one thriving on damp wood surfaces, one typical of long-standing stagnant water, and one rare strain found only in low airflow enclosed spaces. This strongly supported the hypothesis that Evan had been held in a location near water, but not in an outdoor environment, and certainly not left adrift on the lake surface. Overall examination showed Evan's body had received no medical treatment whatsoever during the 6 years of absence. No recent injection sites, no signs of antibiotics, no evidence of surgery or recently changed dressings. Micro-damage patterns in muscles and skin indicated the body had repeatedly self-healed without any professional medical support, a feature common in victims completely isolated from health care. This also eliminated the possibility that Evan had been in a medical facility, rescue center, or had contact with emergency care services during his disappearance. When all medical data was synthesized, the attending physician issued the overall assessment that Evan had endured years of severe movement restriction, no sunlight exposure, prolonged residence in a dark and damp controlled environment, inadequate nutrition, and zero medical care. These indicators were temporally consistent, with all manifestations aligning precisely with the period from 2011 to 2016. Exactly the time frame Evan had been reported missing. At the same time, specialists noted that his survival upon discovery could not be explained by a scenario of self-sustenance in the natural environment, further reinforcing the likelihood that he had been held in a controlled location where a perpetrator had maintained his life at minimal nutritional levels. This information was immediately transmitted to investigative authorities, accompanied by the official medical conclusion. Evan Kade is the victim of prolonged confinement lasting at least 5 years, under conditions of restricted light exposure, severely restricted movement, and residence in a controlled, dark, damp environment. This report forced the case file to be reclassified according to its true nature, rendering the previous accident conclusion no longer tenable, and clearly establishing that Evan's disappearance was not an accident, but the result of deliberate, sustained criminal conduct over many years. 3 days after being admitted to Barton Memorial Hospital, and with his physiological condition having stabilized somewhat, Evan began showing clear reactions to voice and light, though he was still unable to communicate fully. By the 5th day of treatment, he kept his eyes open longer and could respond to short questions in a weak voice. The investigative team, in coordination with the psychologist and medical staff, conducted the first information-gathering session, focusing on the most basic memories Evan could describe without causing mental overload. When asked about the environment where he had been held for many years, Evan first described sounds, the steady hum of a generator, occasionally dipping then surging again, like an old or poorly maintained device echoing in a confined space. He also mentioned the sound of a metal door closing, heavy, with resonance, distinct from wooden or interior doors. Additionally, Evan clearly recalled the regular dripping of water, sometimes faster, sometimes slower, echoing down from a higher position, leading investigators to note the possibility he was held near a water source, but not in an outdoor environment. Regarding the structure where he was kept, Evan said the space was very narrow, just enough for him to take a few steps, but not stand upright or move freely. The floor was old, damp wood that creaked faintly whenever he shifted position or moved. There were no windows or any natural light. All light he saw came from a small bulb that frequently flickered or was turned on and off at fixed intervals, he could not determine. The air in the room was constantly humid, sometimes colder at night, even if it might have been midsummer outside. These features matched previous medical indicators, a confined, damp, light-deprived environment over a long period. When asked about the person who was with him on the day the boat disappeared, Evan confirmed that Mark Helson was still alive during the initial period of their captivity. He remembered that for roughly the first 2 years, though he could not pinpoint the exact months, he occasionally heard Mark speaking, moving, or being taken out of his separate room to receive food or water. Evan did not see Mark directly, but Mark's voice and cough were distinctive enough for him to recognize. After a point Evan could not specify, Mark's sounds no longer appeared. His description suggested that initially both were held in separate but nearby rooms, possibly within the same enclosed structure or adjacent within a larger shared space. Investigators continued to ask Evan to recall any schedule or habits of the captor that he could remember. Evan stated that he had no ability to distinguish day from night due to the absence of natural light, but he believed food was delivered on an almost fixed cycle, possibly once or twice per day. Sometimes he heard heavy, slow footsteps, seemingly those of an adult man passing through a hallway, followed immediately by the sound of a metal mechanism unlocking, then artificial light from outside the room spilling in for a few seconds. Evan could not recall the captor's face or voice, but he mentioned a short phrase he heard spoken at an unspecified time. "There's nowhere to go." He was unsure who the statement was directed at, but it left a strong impression due to its flat, emotionless delivery. When asked about spatial sensations or environmental changes, Evan described that the wooden floor sometimes had a slight vibration, as if there was water movement underneath. He also felt cold air rising from the floor in the evenings, combined with the constant dripping water, leading him to believe his room was right next to or directly above a body of water or a structure in direct contact with the lake. This was consistent with many old boathouses or boat storage compartments built partially below ground level, where wooden flooring interfaced directly with lake water. Investigators noted that Evan's description of the confinement environment was consistent and contained many details relating to architectural features of lakeside structures built decades earlier, including old boat chambers, equipment storage cellars, or underground compartments near the waterline. Evan's description of the generator's sound and the characteristic echo of dripping water raised the possibility that the confinement environment was not only near the lake but also in a structure directly interfacing with the water surface or positioned above flowing water intake. Combining these details, the investigative team formed an initial inference: Evan had been held in a fixed environment for many years, not moved repeatedly. The confinement space was near the lake or on a waterside structure. The floor was old wood with high humidity, and the sole power source was a generator, indicating an isolated location without external utility connections. Although Evan's statement was still limited and fragmented due to the prolonged effects of captivity, the details he provided were sufficient for investigators to identify a key point. The place of his confinement was not a random space, but most likely a type of lakeside structure, enclosed, narrow, lacking natural light, and in frequent contact with water in ways that ordinary shore-built structures could not produce. These were the first pieces of information that helped identify the nature of the confinement environment Evan endured for many years, while also marking the point when the investigation shifted from recording accounts to the stage of specific location analysis. All data from Evan's initial statement was subsequently transferred to the Interdisciplinary Analysis Group under the Sheriff's Office and Cold Case Unit for independent scientific evaluation. The initial analysis focused on the sound elements Evan described, particularly the steady but clearly intermittent surging of the generator. The audio engineering team compared this description with databases of civilian and industrial generators commonly used around Tahoe during the 2000-2010 period. Based on the timbre, vibration intensity, and throttling dip pattern Evan described, experts ruled out newer engine generators with more stable governors. The team focused on small gasoline generators produced between 1995 and 2007, commonly used at lakeside cabins without grid electricity. These models produce a heavy, even sound that easily loses rhythm under sudden load increases or with old fuel. This suggested the confinement environment might belong to an old, poorly maintained structure without main power. Continued analysis of humidity and Evan's skin condition further reinforced this hypothesis. Dermatologists and environmental biologists compared skin samples from multiple body sites against standard data on prolonged humid exposure. Evan's skin showed characteristic moisture absorption from an environment near water, but not direct immersion. Mineral salt and trace element levels in the samples were lower than typically seen in individuals naturally exposed to Lake Tahoe water, indicating he was not submerged or living in a flooded environment. Instead, the skin surface contained micro traces of decomposing organic matter, typical of enclosed spaces, characteristic of boat chambers, damp wooden cellars, or subfloor spaces directly above water. Doctors confirmed this was compatible with the cold air rising from the floor sensation Evan previously described. Biological analysis continued with examination of insects, pollen, and microorganisms remaining on Evan's hair and clothing, although most of his clothing consisted of synthetic fibers that retained few environmental traces. Fabric crevices still held some microscopic insect specimens. Entomologists identified multiple individuals of Collembola springtails and several yeast samples characteristic of cold, damp areas, organisms that typically inhabit places without sunlight for extended periods. These insects are rarely found in normal residences or lit lakeside structures, but are common in old wooden cabins, disused boathouses, or long-abandoned boat storage compartments. This made shaded, poorly ventilated, infrequently visited areas a priority for geographic narrowing. Meanwhile, the hydrodynamic simulation team was tasked with reconstructing the drift model of the Silver Finch boat at the time it was discovered in 2016. Based on the boat's position at Rubicon Point, wind speed on the morning of August 22nd, and near-shore current patterns, the model indicated the boat could not have reached that location through completely natural drift from the middle of the lake. Simulation results showed the time the boat was released or pushed out from its hiding place must have been from the western shoreline area, within no more than 1 nautical mile of shore. Various test models, including wind drift, bay vortex drift, and light collision impact, all converged on the same conclusion: the boat had been deliberately released from its concealment shortly before discovery by the kayaker, and the release area was near the western shore rather than mid-lake or elsewhere. When synthesizing the 3 lines of analysis, generator sound, skin evidence from near-water environment, and indicator insects, the investigative team noted a clear correlation with small lakeside wooden structures lacking light, abandoned cabins with cellars, old boathouses, or subfloor boat compartments. The boat drift simulation data allowed narrowing the search area to a specific segment of Lake Tahoe's western shore, stretching from Rubicon Point to the southern part of Sugar Pine Point. From there, the geographic analysis team cross-referenced building records and land ownership over the past 30 years to identify structures that once existed or had been abandoned in the area. County archives showed that in the late 1980s and early 1990s, this stretch of shoreline had more than a dozen small private cabins and several boathouses connected to forest trails. Many of these structures were abandoned when owners left the area or when stricter shoreline regulations were enforced. By 2016, many of these cabins were unused, without electricity, and unmaintained, perfectly matching Evan's description of the confinement space. To further narrow the list, the terrain analysis group created a layered map based on 3 criteria. Older structures were more consistent with the generator description. Structures close to the water were highly likely to contain a damp environment, and structures in dense shade were most likely to match the collected insect samples. After GIS processing, 3 prominent clusters of structures emerged on the map, reported as 3 main clusters. The first cluster was near the northern edge of Rubicon Point, consisting of 2 old cabins abandoned since 1994. The second cluster was midway along a rocky slope, containing a privately owned boathouse abandoned after 2001. The third cluster comprised 3 cabins set farther back from shore, but still directly connected to water through rock fissures, previously used for equipment storage by a small facility decades earlier. All 3 clusters fell within the radius, consistent with the boat drift model and matched the described environmental characteristics. The final interdisciplinary analysis report was submitted to the investigative unit to proceed with ground surveys, prioritizing each cluster in order of fit, starting with the most likely abandoned cabins and boathouses capable of containing a narrow, damp, wooden-floored space with echoing generator sounds, as Evan had described. After the interdisciplinary analysis group narrowed down 3 clusters of potentially related structures, the field investigation team immediately began on-site surveys, starting with the first cluster where 2 old wooden cabins sat close to the forest edge, only about 300 meters from Rubicon Point. Cabin A was the first approached. It was a small pinewood structure built in the 1970s and left almost untouched since 1994, according to property records. When the team opened the cabin, they found thick dust layers, cobwebs covering corners and furniture, and a severely water-damaged, splintered wooden floor in many places. All items inside, from broken wooden beds to old storage crates, showed signs of decades of abandonment with no intervention whatsoever. No food, no household trash, no recent fingerprints, no evidence consistent with Evan's described confinement environment. The field team recorded Cabin A as completely unrelated and removed it from the list during the very first survey session. Cabin B, in the second cluster, was located about 100 meters farther from the lake and built more solidly with thicker timber framing and a metal roof. Upon approach, the team noticed the front door was unlocked, but showed signs of having been opened in recent years. Inside the cabin, dust layers were thinner, and many items did not match the documented abandonment timeline. Most notably, numerous empty canned food containers, instant noodle packaging, empty plastic bottles, and used bags were found, the majority bearing expiration dates in the 2013-2015 range. Some containers were discovered under the bed, in corners, and on wooden shelves, indicating human activity relatively close to the time of Evan's disappearance. However, Cabin B showed no signs of long-term confinement, no restraints, no fully enclosed lightless areas, no damp wooden floor structure as described. Investigators also detected no generator echo or water source immediately adjacent to the floor. In terms of spatial organization, Cabin B appeared to be a temporary shelter, possibly used over a few years, but it lacked the conditions necessary for prolonged detention of a person. The collected waste was sent for DNA and fingerprint analysis, but nothing immediately matched Evan's records. Cabin B was assessed as related to human activity during the 2013-2015 period, but not consistent with the confinement environment the analysis group was seeking. Cabin C in the third cluster was set farther back from shore, but built on elevated rock foundation with a direct water connection through a narrow rock fissure leading down to the lake. It was the largest of the 3 surveyed sites and had a more complex layout with 2 small rooms and a main area. The exterior showed no recent human presence, but investigators noticed differences immediately upon entering. The wooden floor in the main area was relatively intact, yet a large section near the east wall had been replaced with newer, darker wooden planks installed in a manner inconsistent with the cabin's original construction style. This anomaly drew the team's focus to that area. Upon closer inspection, they found clean, straight cuts along the edges of the planks, clear evidence the floor had been removed and reinstalled, contrary to the original design, which had no basement or access below. A borescope camera was inserted through small gaps between the planks and remaining original flooring. The returned images showed a dark, low-ceilinged void beneath the floor, with signs of prolonged moisture, matching Evan's described environment. Handheld device measurements showed significantly lower temperature and higher humidity compared to the air above, consistent with Evan's skin analysis data. The rock edge, a few meters from the cabin, indicated Cabin C was likely constructed over a foundation leading directly to water or a water-adjacent compartment. This aligned with Evan hearing constant dripping water and experiencing a damp wooden floor over many years. Beyond the floor area, Cabin C also showed signs of relatively recent human modification, evidenced by oil and grease marks on certain ceiling joists, typical of machinery operation, possibly a generator. While the main cabin space showed no confinement signs, the subfloor structure presented a completely different possibility. After completing the day's survey, the field team filed a report stating, Cabin A eliminated, Cabin B showed human activity but did not match confinement conditions, and Cabin C exhibited significant structural anomalies, particularly the replaced wooden floor section and underlying void. Cabin C became the primary focus of investigation, the only structure among the 3 cabins with construction features and environmental characteristics sufficiently consistent with Evan's account of the space where he was held for many years. Right after Cabin C was identified as the highest priority suspect location, the on-site investigation team proceeded to dismantle the wooden floor sections that showed cuts inconsistent with the original design. The wooden planks were manually lifted to avoid disturbing the underlying structure, and beneath the floor was a void much larger than initially anticipated. A sloped passageway leading down into a dark space, reinforced with old wooden beams and rusty metal supports. When the lighting team lowered equipment, a large area gradually came into view, not merely a simple sealed cellar, but an underground boathouse, situated about 3 meters below the cabin ground level, and directly adjacent to the water through a rock fissure connecting to the lake. This junction showed water stains and damp marks on the walls and wooden floor, consistent with what Evan had described. At the edge of the boathouse, investigators discovered a metal rail system extending from the wall all the way to the open doorway facing the water. The rails exhibited heavy sliding wear, worn in the direction from inside to outside, indicating they had been used to pull a heavy object, most likely a boat. Under close UV light examination, they found traces of machine oil mixed with faint silver paint residue, matching the color of the Silver Finch boat. This was the first piece of evidence suggesting the missing boat had once been brought into this location. Next to the rail system, the team found a sturdy hand-operated metal mechanism functioning as a boat winch lest. The structure consisted of a large rotating shaft, steel cable wound around it, and a pulling hook anchored firmly to the floor, all showing years of use. Several components were coated with thick machine oil layers, indicating regular lubrication to maintain smooth operation. With this mechanism, the perpetrator could pull the boat from the lake surface into the underground boathouse and then seal the door completely, making the boat vanish from sight. Deeper inside the boathouse, in the area no longer directly influenced by lake water, the investigation team discovered a small enclosed section, walled off with thick wooden panels and old metal sheets, forming a narrow confinement cell exactly as Evan had described. A space barely large enough for one person to sit and lie curled up, with a low ceiling, no windows, and only a small ventilation hole. On the wall were rusty steel hook marks, still attached to an old length of chain with a heavy padlock. The lock showed long-term abrasion wear. The wooden floor below had indentations in 2 distinct spots, places where a person would have been forced to sit or kneel for extended periods, matching the calluses on Evan's body. On the floor they also found an old, faded, and damp wool sweater, along with a thin blanket frayed at the edges. Both items contained biological samples matching Evan's DNA through rapid testing. This confirmed he had spent a prolonged period in this exact location. Adjacent to the confinement cell, an old wooden table stood against the wall, holding various items, opened moisture-resistant food cans, food wrapper remnants, and a discolored hardcover notebook. When opened, it revealed a handwritten log with irregular handwriting, spanning entries from 2011 to 2016. The content was not emotional journaling, but short, factual notes in the format. Date actions such as refuel, feed, check lock, noise, light outside wall. Some entries mentioned old fuel, generator misfiring, rising water, indicating the underground boathouse was maintained with a regularly running generator. Certain recurring monthly notes used the letters B and K, meaning unclear but recorded consistently over years. Next to the log were an old flashlight, a basic toolkit, and the cut remnant of a cable. The deeper the team went into the boathouse, the more signs they found of long-term human use. Machine oil cans, desiccant jars, wooden blocks used for equipment repairs, and consistent shoe prints. Most importantly, the entire environment matched Evan's statements in every detail. Generator noise, dripping water from external rock fissures, cold, damp wooden floor, lack of natural light, and the narrow chained confinement cell. Initial scene analysis showed ceiling and wall dampness, indicating seasonal lake water rise, creating the distinctive microbial environment matching samples from Evan's body. The consistently low temperature even at midday confirmed complete isolation from sunlight and natural ventilation, exactly as Evan described, not knowing whether it was day or night outside. Rapid testing of biological samples collected from the confinement cell surfaces found DNA matching Evan's profile at multiple locations on the chain, on the blanket, in floorboard cracks, and even on a rusty metal nail. This confirmed his long-term presence, not incidental or brief contact. Some non-matching samples were also collected and sent for deeper analysis at the central lab. The preliminary on-site report concluded that Cabin C, and especially the underground boathouse beneath it, was the long-term holding site for Evan throughout his years of disappearance. The space not only matched structurally and environmentally, but contained sufficient physical evidence, from chain marks to DNA, to confirm its role as the actual detention site, explaining both the biological findings and Evan's fragmented memories. During the expanded examination of the underground boathouse beneath Cabin C, the investigation team continued surveying the least accessible areas, particularly the rock floor near the water's edge, where high humidity and uneven surfaces made access difficult. While one investigator used a soil probe to check accumulated sediment in the western rock fissure, the tool struck a hard object with a different response than natural stone. Manual excavation with specialized tools followed immediately to avoid damaging the object. Within minutes, a human bone fragment approximately 4 centimeters in size was uncovered, lying deep under thin mud and stained dark brown from prolonged moisture. Recognizing the gravity, the scene was expanded and secured, and a specialized forensic team arrived at Cabin C within 1 hour. As the grid pattern excavation expanded, additional scattered bone fragments were found, including small joint portions, a partially broken long bone segment, and 2 fragments with structural features indicating they belonged to the upper limb of a human. The dispersed positions suggested the body had decomposed in place in the damp enclosed environment with no major post-mortem movement. That same evening, DNA was extracted from the largest bone fragment at the mobile analysis lab. Initial genetic markers showed a high match with the profile of Mark Helson, the individual who disappeared alongside Evan in 2010. For absolute confirmation, the sample was sent to the State Forensic Laboratory for further comparison with Mark's relative samples. 2 days later, official results confirmed the bone belonged to Mark Helson, establishing that he had not only been held here, but had died inside the underground boathouse. This discovery immediately shifted the investigation's focus from prolonged abduction to abduction and death in custody. Further forensic analysis of the remaining bone fragments revealed clear signs of antemortem or perimortem fractures, including an oblique fracture on the tibia and a compression crack on the humerus. Bone trauma experts concluded these injuries occurred while the victim was alive or immediately before death, most likely from a hard fall in confined space or from being restrained. The fracture severity indicated significant force, but not immediately fatal. Bone surfaces also showed prolonged infection, abnormal bone proliferation at fracture edges, indicating weeks or even months of painful infection. The damp, low-oxygen environment of the underground boathouse exacerbated the infection, leading to systemic failure and eventual death. Forensics estimated time of death around 2013, based on bone decomposition level, overlying sediment condition, and moisture-related wear. This time frame perfectly matched Evan's account, in which he stated that during the first 2 years, he could still hear Mark speaking or moving nearby, before complete silence set in at a point he could not precisely recall. The alignment between forensic timeline and Evan's memory strongly reinforced the conclusion that Mark had been held together with Evan for approximately the first 2 years of disappearance, then died from injuries and infection inside the underground boathouse. The team continued searching the surrounding rock floor for more traces of Mark, and in the deepest corner, discovered a decayed fabric remnant consisting of only a few synthetic fibers. Rapid analysis showed the material matched the type of jacket Mark was wearing on the morning of September 14, 2010, when he set out with Evan. A small rusty metal piece, likely a jacket zipper pull, was found right beside the fabric, adding further physical confirmation of Mark's presence at the death site. On the nearby rock surface, forensic examiners found small scratch clusters oriented downward and concentrated in a narrow area. Analysis indicated these were human fingernail scratches left while desperately clutching the hard surface in a state of extreme weakness. Although complete DNA could not be extracted from the dead cells, the team noted these marks were consistent with prolonged restraint or binding. Another detail particularly noted by forensics, one humerus fragment showed a narrow, unusual groove distinct from trauma fractures. Microscopic examination revealed it as long-term abrasion from thin metal wire, matching the chain and lock found in the confinement cell. This indicated Mark had also been restrained in a manner similar to what Evan described. Combining all evidence, bones, fabric, scratch marks, chain abrasion, the team constructed a detailed timeline. Both victims were held at Cabin C from the earliest days of disappearance. Mark suffered serious injury during the first or second year, received no medical care, developed prolonged infection, and died around 2013. His body was left in the underground boathouse to decompose naturally in the dark, damp environment. The discovery of Mark's remains not only confirmed him as the second victim, but also validated the authenticity of Evan's fragmented memories. It completely eliminated the 2010 accident hypothesis, as it was impossible for Mark to have drowned and then have his remains appear inside a sealed structure, isolated from the natural lake. The overall forensic conclusion was clearly stated in the official report. Biological traces, physical evidence, and decomposition data all prove that Mark Helson was held together with Evan in the underground boathouse beneath Cabin C. He died under conditions of restricted movement and lack of medical care. The time of death aligns with Evan's testimony, and Cabin C served as the long-term detention site for both victims from 2010 to 2016. Once the evidence at the underground boathouse seen beneath Cabin C clearly established the long-term holding location for both Evan and Mark, the next step for the investigation team was to focus on identifying the perpetrator. Priority was given to collecting biological samples that did not match the two victims, with particular emphasis on fingerprints remaining on the boat winch mechanism, metal door handles, and several items on the wooden table. After completing the magnetic powder lifting process and high-resolution photography, the forensic lab conducted comparison against state and federal fingerprint databases. Within less than 2 hours of matching, the AFA system returned a hit. Gideon Marsh, male, 48 years old, a longtime South Lake Tahoe resident, who went missing in 2010. This name appeared for the first time in the case file and immediately became the central focus of the investigation. According to background records, Gideon worked as a marine mechanic specializing in boat engines and generators, employed at Tahoe Keys Marina from 2007 to 2009. This professional experience perfectly explained the presence of the hand-built boat winch in the underground boathouse, as well as the reliable long-term operation of the old generator in an enclosed space. A system only someone with mechanical expertise could maintain without main power. Employment records also showed Gideon performed numerous repair jobs for cabin and boathouse owners along the west shore during 2008, including the property where Cabin C is located. A county land record from that year documented Gideon signing a small contract for reinforcing the foundation structure of Cabin C. While details did not specify the exact work, it was sufficient to prove he had legitimate prior access to the structure before it was abandoned. After leaving Tahoe Keys Marina in late 2009, Gideon's records showed increasing instability. Several reports of disorderly conduct in the community, mild hallucinations, and inconsistent statements to law enforcement. In June 2010, 3 months before Evan and Mark's disappearance, a local medical facility recorded Gideon exhibiting cognitive impairment, poor behavioral control, and a family request for psychiatric evaluation. However, he left the hospital against medical advice before full assessment, with no relatives stepping forward as guardians. By August 2010, just 1 month before the two fishermen vanished, the last police report on Gideon noted that he had left his residence and his whereabouts were unknown, though he had not yet been officially declared missing. This meant Gideon disappeared from the community immediately before Evan and Mark vanished, coinciding with the abandonment of Cabin C and the subsequent conversion of its underground boathouse into a detention site. When the fingerprints recovered from the scene, especially clear prints on the confinement cell door handle, the winch mechanism, and most distinctly on a machine oil can next to the wooden table, were compared. They matched at 15 points, far exceeding the minimum threshold for positive identification. This was not incidental presence. The frequency and location of fingerprints at key functional points throughout the boathouse showed Gideon had directly operated, repaired, and maintained the detention structure. Combined with his former occupation, this created a logical connection between skill set, site access, and intended use. Further analysis of the logbook, recovered from the boathouse, revealed handwriting that matched Gideon's signature samples from 2008 repair contracts, particularly the distinctive formation of the letters G and M. This was confirmed by a handwriting expert, strengthening the hypothesis that Gideon himself recorded the operational timelines of the boathouse, even though the log content did not directly describe criminal acts. Another factor, making Gideon the prime suspect, was his mobility. From 2007 to 2009, his boat mechanic work gave him access to numerous lakeside boathouses, including Cabin C, where he had worked on foundation repairs at the owner's request. Knowledge of groundwater channels, wooden structures, boat launching mechanisms, and sealed entry systems provided ideal conditions for him to convert Cabin C into a secret detention site. Information about Gideon's deteriorating mental state further prompted investigators to consider the possibility of solitary action driven by cyclical cognitive disorder or paranoia. Several people who knew him before 2010 reported that at times Gideon became suspicious of others, believing there were watchers or that outside is not safe, obsessive statements that could relate to systematically isolating the two victims inside the boathouse. After identifying Gideon Marsh as the primary suspect, the sheriff's office promptly forwarded the file to the El Dorado County District Attorney's Office. Within 24 hours, an arrest warrant was requested on charges, including first-degree kidnapping, prolonged unlawful imprisonment, assault causing death, and concealment of a corpse. Given the continuous criminal conduct from 2010 to 2016, the prosecutor issued a statewide California arrest warrant for Gideon Marsh and placed him on 3-tier wanted status, including federal alerts should he cross state lines. The warrant marked a major turning point in the case, with the perpetrator's identity now clearly established through physical evidence, site access history, and psychological behavioral factors. The entire investigative force now shifted to a full manhunt for Gideon Marsh, the individual who vanished from the community precisely when the two victims were abducted and who now stood responsible for one of the most serious prolonged detention cases ever recorded at Lake Tahoe. Immediately after the arrest warrant for Gideon Marsh was issued, police units and ranger teams began sweeping areas Gideon was known to frequent before 2010. A passerby in the Emerald Bay area reported seeing a lone man with long disheveled hair, a hunched gait, carrying a large backpack, and avoiding contact with others, a description matching Gideon's appearance in his final years in the region. When a patrol team approached the Desolation Wilderness perimeter the following morning, they discovered fresh footprints on damp soil near the Bayview trailhead. As the team advanced about 1 mile deeper, a man suddenly fled from dense forest cover upon spotting police, behavior that immediately led the pursuit team to identify him as Gideon. The chase rapidly extended into the steep terrain of Desolation Wilderness, where numerous rock crevices, small streams, and thick forest provided cover for Gideon to escape. K-9 units, drones, and ground teams were deployed, but Gideon appeared intimately familiar with the terrain, as though he had lived in the wilderness for years. The pursuit lasted a full 48 hours, with several moments when police were less than 200 meters from Gideon, but could not close the distance due to treacherous terrain and obstructed visibility from granite outcrops and old-growth trees. On the second night, tracking teams spotted thin smoke rising near Eagle Falls, an area with numerous water channels and sheer cliffs. As they closed in, Gideon fled along a rock slope toward the falls, but this time units had blocked the remaining escape routes. After one final attempt to flee, Gideon was safely taken into custody on the north bank of Eagle Falls. On his person was a heavy backpack containing handmade items, a multi-tool knife, a small coil of steel wire, an old-style flashlight, and an open bottle of machine oil. These items closely matched tools recovered from the underground boathouse beneath Cabin C, especially the steel wire type and oil container bearing similar markings. Additionally, Gideon's shoes showed wear patterns consistent with footprints found on the boathouse floor, further reinforcing his presence at the detention site. Upon capture, Gideon offered no further resistance but remained completely silent, staring fixedly at the ground. He was escorted out of the Eagle Falls area via a safe trail and transported to Carson City for medical evaluation before being placed in custody. All seized items were immediately sent to the forensic lab for detailed comparison with samples collected from the boathouse, further expanding evidence linking Gideon to the long-term detention scene. The manhunt concluded with Gideon's safe apprehension, ending 48 hours of intense pursuit across the rugged terrain of Desolation Wilderness and paving the way for the next phase of criminal prosecution. After being arrested and taken into custody at Carson City, Gideon Marsh immediately became the focus of a large-scale interrogation conducted jointly by the Sheriff's Office and the El Dorado County District Attorney's Office. In the first interrogation session, Gideon maintained a prolonged silence, occasionally staring blankly at the wall as if unaware of his surroundings. When directly questioned about Cabin C, the underground boathouse, or the two victims, Evan and Mark, Gideon responded with only 4 words, "I don't know anything." In subsequent sessions, investigators attempted to approach him using behavioral methods, asking about his previous jobs, habits repairing generators, and experience operating boats. But Gideon completely denied any involvement, repeatedly saying, "It wasn't me," regardless of the question's intensity. Although the suspect remained uncooperative, the investigation did not rely on his statements. The entire forensic comparison process was initiated to strengthen the case based on physical evidence. DNA samples collected from the rusted chain in the cell, particularly the section near the lock, revealed a mixture of cells from 2 individuals. One was Evan Kade's DNA, fully matching his hospital records. The other, after being run through the federal CODIS system, matched DNA from Gideon's 2010 medical records. An 18-point match was confirmed, sufficient to establish that Gideon had directly handled the chain used to restrain the victim. Gideon's DNA also appeared on the metal door handle leading down to the boathouse, on the edge of the wooden frame at the entrance area, and on 2 items on the wooden table, a can of machine oil and the handle of a wrench. Forensic analysis concluded that these were not random contact traces, but residues left through repeated use over many years. Another strong cluster of evidence came from the journal recovered in the boathouse. Handwriting experts compared stroke patterns, letter structure, line spacing, and especially the shapes of the frequently appearing characters G, M, and K with Gideon's signature on the 2008 boathouse repair contract and 3 prior administrative forms in his civil records. All characteristics matched at a high level, including letter slant, spacing proportions between letter stems, and up-down strokes. The handwriting report concluded there was a 99.4% probability that the journal was written by Gideon Marsh. A critical finding because the journal covered the period 2011-2016, precisely when Evan was held captive. In the journal, recurring entries such as feeding, check locks, generator weak, old fuel, and noises appeared in regular cycles, consistent with a pattern of maintaining the cell. Some short entries using the letters B and K were suggested by forensics as possible internal notations for boat or Kade. Though not conclusively proven, they indicated the perpetrator was monitoring 2 key elements, the means of transport and the victim. Shoe impressions were another crucial link. In the boathouse, investigators documented multiple worn footprints showing a right-leaning gait, matching Gideon's abnormal walking pattern observed at the time of his arrest near Eagle Falls. The crime scene shoe prints featured the distinctive sole pattern of a popular line of mechanics' boots from the 2000s. When compared to the boots Gideon was wearing at the time of arrest, forensics found 13 points of perfect correspondence, including a small tear on the edge of the left sole and cross-worn rubber near the heel. Additionally, sediment samples found under Gideon's shoes were identical to the damp soil and mud samples from the boathouse's stone floor. Geological forensics concluded that this could not be coincidental, as the sediment contained microbiological characteristics unique to the area immediately surrounding Cabin C, not present at Eagle Falls or anywhere else in Desolation Wilderness. Besides DNA and shoe evidence, another key piece was the wood-cutting tool recovered from Gideon's backpack at the time of arrest. It was a specialized short-bladed hand saw suitable for cutting small wooden beams in confined spaces. Forensics compared the saw blade to the cut marks on Cabin C's floor and found matching depth, width, and tooth mark patterns. The saw marks on the floor indicated the perpetrator had repeatedly removed and reinstalled sections of the flooring, consistent with disguising the entrance to the boathouse. Microscopic wood particles remaining on the saw blade also matched the old pine wood of Cabin C, confirming the tool had been used at the scene. When all the evidence was compiled, the sheriff's office and district attorney's office prepared the official charging document. The case file included DNA matches between Gideon and items in the cell, handwriting analysis proving the journal was written by Gideon, matching shoe impressions, wood-cutting tool with corresponding marks on Cabin C's floor, the journal showing a long-term cycle of care and confinement, Evan's DNA and Mark's bone samples, evidence of Mark's death from fracture and subsequent infection, and full documentation of the underground boathouse containing an illegal confinement structure. The prosecutor then filed charges consisting of 3 groups of offenses: 1 first-degree kidnapping with aggravating circumstances due to confinement lasting over 5 years, 2 false imprisonment under conditions causing prolonged physical and mental deterioration, 3 second-degree murder of victim Mark Helson with aggravating factors due to the victim dying while restrained and without medical care. Despite Gideon continuing to deny all charges, the case file was deemed complete, consistent, and sufficiently compelling to proceed to trial in the county superior court. The entire interrogation process, though yielding no confession, further reinforced the argument that Gideon deliberately concealed the truth, in stark contrast to the tight, cohesive body of forensic evidence, all pointing in the same direction: that he was the one who built, operated, and maintained the underground boathouse, the place where Evan was held and where Mark died. The trial of Gideon Marsh began in September 2017 in El Dorado County Superior Court, drawing significant regional media attention due to the severity and rarity of the case, a 6-year prolonged kidnapping, confinement in an underground boathouse, and the death of one victim. From the very first day, the prosecution presented charges consisting of 3 main groups: first-degree kidnapping with aggravating circumstances, unlawful confinement causing physical and mental deterioration, and second-degree murder related to Mark Helson's death. The prosecution's opening focused on reconstructing the entire timeline from September 2010 to August 2016, using photographs, forensic documents, and diagrams of Cabin C and the underground boathouse, maps showing the movements of the Silver Finch boat, diagrams of the cell structure, images of DNA, bone samples, and floor cut marks were displayed to help the jury understand the absolute level of control Gideon exerted over the victims. One of the strengths of the case was the consistency between forensic evidence, witness testimony, and environmental details, Gideon's DNA on the chain, the journal written by him matching shoe impressions, the wood-cutting tool matching crime scene, Mark's microbiological samples from Evan's body matching the boathouse environment, and Mark's time of death aligning with the statement that after the first 2 years, he no longer heard his friend. When witness testimony began, Evan Kade took the stand, becoming the only living witness able to describe the experience inside the underground boathouse. In court, despite still being affected by years of captivity, Evan testified calmly and consistently. The sound of the generator, dripping water, metal door, damp wooden floor, confined space, and prolonged darkness. He confirmed that the person who brought food and unlocked the cell was a silent man, tall, with a right-leaning gait, matching Gideon's abnormal walk observed at arrest. When the prosecutor asked Evan to identify Gideon, he looked directly at the defendant and stated, "That's him." The courtroom fell completely silent. The defense's cross-examination attempted to question the accuracy of Evan's memory after so many years of confinement, but the prosecution quickly countered by cross-referencing the testimony with forensic traces that matched in every detail. The defense then shifted to arguing that Gideon was mentally unstable at the time of the offenses, attempting to prove he lacked capacity to understand his actions. However, medical records showed Gideon had behavioral disorders but retained cognitive capacity. Moreover, the systematic journal entries over many years demonstrated his ability to organize, maintain a system, and conceal the confinement location, actions requiring intent and control. The defense's next attempt was to find weaknesses in the crime scene analysis. They argued that the boathouse could have been used by someone else or a group before Gideon, but forensics immediately rebutted by providing a chain of Gideon's DNA on multiple operational surfaces, while no other DNA profile repeated in a similar cycle. This proved Gideon was the only person interacting with the boathouse throughout 2011-2016. One of the pivotal pieces of evidence that completely convinced the jury was the comparison of the wood-cutting tool recovered from Gideon's backpack at arrest. The saw blade left tooth mark patterns, depth, and vibration signatures identical to the cuts on Cabin C's floor, something the prosecution called the perpetrator's physical signature. The defense could offer no reasonable explanation for this match. In the closing argument, the prosecutor stated that Gideon Marsh's conduct spanned 6 years, including kidnapping, unlawful confinement, severe bodily harm, and failure to provide medical care leading to Mark's death. The prosecution described it as one of the most protracted, brutal, and deliberate confinement cases ever recorded in the state of California. When it was the defense's turn, counsel could only repeat the 2 familiar arguments: mental condition and lack of motive evidence. However, under California law, motive is not a required element when the criminal acts and physical evidence chain are sufficient to constitute the offenses. After 2 weeks of trial, the case went to jury deliberation. The jury took only 6 hours, an exceptionally short time for such a complex case, to reach a verdict. Defendant Gideon Marsh guilty on all counts. When asked to read the verdict, the jury foreperson announced, "Guilty on all counts." Gideon showed no emotion, continuing to stare at the floor as he had throughout the trial. At sentencing, the judge acknowledged the particularly grave nature of the case: years-long confinement, deliberate conduct, death by abandonment, and systematic cruelty. After citing aggravating factors under the California Penal Code, the judge delivered the final sentence: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The sentence was pronounced in a completely silent courtroom, marking the end of a more than 7-year journey since Evan and Mark went missing, and closing one of the most shocking cases in the Lake Tahoe area in decades. After the 2017 trial and the life without parole sentence handed down to Gideon Marsh, the case officially closed, but its aftermath lingered for many years. Evan Kade, the sole survivor, moved to Oregon at his personal request and began a long-term recovery process, both physically and mentally. Psychological experts described his case as one of the most complex instances of post-prolonged confinement they had encountered: sleep disorders, hypersensitivity to mechanical sounds, fear of confined spaces, and sudden intrusive fragmented memories requiring ongoing treatment. Nevertheless, Evan tried to rebuild his life, working part-time in a small woodworking shop and living quietly away from the media, maintaining only limited contact with his support team and family. As for Mark Helson's family, after the identification process was completed, they received his cremated remains and held a small memorial on the north shore of Lake Tahoe, where Mark had fished for many years before disappearing. The ceremony was quiet, with no press present, attended only by family and a few old friends. The remaining ashes were scattered over the lake in accordance with Mark's previously expressed wishes, a way of returning him to the place he loved most. At Lake Tahoe, the case's impact prompted the local community and authorities to review the entire system for managing abandoned cabins in the West Shore area. New regulations were enacted in 2018, requiring periodic inspections of all old structures, especially those with underground elements or adjacent to water. Structures without legitimate owners or failing safety standards were ordered to be demolished or sealed to prevent unauthorized use. Cabin C, the crime scene, was completely demolished by county order, the underground boathouse filled in, and the area restored to its natural state. The case file was closed with the final determination: prolonged kidnapping, false imprisonment, second-degree murder. It remains one of the few cases in the region's history to be fully resolved after years of being considered a lake disappearance accident. For the Tahoe community, the case became a reminder of the need for caution and the hidden dangers in seemingly peaceful areas. For Evan and Mark's family, it marked the end of years of pain, but also the beginning of a recovery journey after an indelible tragedy. The story of Evan Kade and Mark Helson is not just an exceptionally serious criminal case, but also a mirror reflecting the quiet problems that exist in modern American life, issues many people continue to underestimate until tragedy strikes. The case demonstrates that even in communities considered safe like Lake Tahoe, where people are familiar with nature and tourism, there still exist dark corners involving abandoned structures, hidden homeless individuals, or people with mental disorders who are not intervened with in time. Gideon Marsh's history of mental illness, job loss, and eventual disappearance from the community without follow-up by the healthcare system reveals real gaps in mental health care in the United States. Clearly, if Gideon had received timely intervention in 2010, Evan and Mark might never have endured 6 years of horror. The story also underscores the importance of monitoring abandoned infrastructure. Cabin C existed for many years without inspection, and that very neglect turned it into the perfect location for a criminal to hide and hold victims. It is a reminder to communities across the United States. Abandoned public spaces are not just wasteful. They can sometimes become dangerous. For individuals, Evan's story makes us understand more deeply that survivors of prolonged kidnappings need not only rescue, but also comprehensive, long-term recovery support. Communities must recognize that healing is not simple and requires patience, companionship, and respect. The biggest lesson from this case is safety does not come solely from nature or law enforcement. It comes from mutual care, vigilance, community responsibility, and serious investment in mental health systems the decisive factors in preventing similar tragedies in the future. Thank you for following this haunting yet powerful story of survival and justice to the end. Please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next in-depth analysis of real cases. See you in the next video, where we continue to explore stories that remind us that vigilance and compassion can change an entire destiny.